We'll go ahead and get started then. Hi, Carol. What do you think? How have you been
Hi.
doing?
Really good. Really looking forward to our session today.
Yeah, me too. Me too. This has been a long time coming. We've been talking about just different aspects of prompt engineering in uh, our regular speaker events. We've been talking about it in our networking events. A lot of interest both in the potential impact to jobs, but also how you might use large language models in user research. And so we've been experimenting at work. I've been experimenting with it and sort of separately from work. Um, and there's some interesting things that I've learned in the process, some of which I wanted to talk about and share today. Um, and I want to focus a little bit on this idea of a debriefing prompt. Um, Debriefing, excuse me, debriefing is one of those use cases I think a lot of researchers, especially those who start in usability, are familiar with. You have a project where you are interviewing customers. Maybe you're interviewing customers and you've got participants, stakeholders in the room with you. And there's always like a lot of insights that kind of come up in the moment. You've also got a discussion guide where you're trying to learn things, and you start writing stuff on the board. You start putting stickies on the wall, that kind of thing. And then when you're done, there's that moment where you reflect on what you just saw. You try to capture all of these ideas in the moment. And then sometimes you'll even memo it. You'll send out an email saying, hey, here's what we learned today. Here's what this participant was able to share, that kind of thing. What if we could have an LLM help us with that work? What if, from a productivity standpoint, we recruited LLMs just to help us capture that in the moment? There could be some productivity gains with that, all kinds of cool potential behind that. And so I wanted to explore that use case, this idea of using LLMs with a debriefing guide. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about that today. We'll talk about the kind of the background of that from a prompt engineering perspective, and then we're going to talk about an experiment that you and I did a few weeks ago. We will hopefully be able to link to it in this video as well, but we did a little mini interview, myself and Caro, on talking about the use of LLMs, talking about how they entered the research space as a professional. And then what we'll do is we'll take a look at what that debriefing guide output might look like. And so I'm looking forward to having that conversation with you. You've had a chance to look at the output, so I'm sure you've formed some ideas and some feedback. So let's jump into it. So let's just jump into it. All right. So as I mentioned, we have this idea of this debriefing case. So you've got, the scenario is you've been working with, or you've been conducting interviews. You have to synthesize that data in real time, and it takes time. If you're just going off of notes from the previous day, or you're working from a week out, you can lose a lot of information if you don't capture that in the moment. And so this is why we do this debriefing or memoing exercise. Usually right after the interview, we capture it while it's still sort of hot in your mind. And what are the things we're doing? We're capturing what are the key points about the customer, what's their job context, what's the occupational context usually of their jobs to be done, that kind of thing. What other kind of information was emergent in the interview? We're also looking at some of the hypotheses that we had coming into the interview. Sometimes we're looking at what evidence either came into the interview that supported or contradicted that hypothesis. And then a lot of times we're just also looking for important quotes that help um, give us some insight from the customer's perspective. Um, you do this so quickly, and oftentimes you're sometimes you're even doing this alone as a researcher. And so what if, as I mentioned before, we had this idea of a debriefing prompt to help you do that. And
And
so
I would say this is also a great moment to have a sounding board with your other research colleagues, if you
right.
happen to have some, to challenge maybe something that is a little bit colored or biased. It's just like, maybe I'm looking this from the perspective of somebody that has worked A, B, and C roles, or that I know or understand the industry. Maybe there's an outsider perspective. So the debriefing is also very rich in that. So it challenges the perspective of who's actually documenting this. And
Sure.
maybe they will
Yeah.
even say, I don't think that's what this person really meant. And that conversation also is really good to have right after one of those sessions.
That that speaks to a couple of things. Potential sort of misinterpretation of what the customer is saying.
Yeah.
Sometimes you're identifying different biases that are kind of invisible in the room.
Mhm.
Those are all really great points. And so the other thing that sometimes comes up is interviewer feedback. What could the interviewer have done differently? What could the interviewer, what highlighting some of those things that the interviewer may not be immediately aware of because they were in the heat of the moment. So
Yeah.
those are, I think, really good points also to bring out as part of a debriefing. Um, so in order to focus on this scenario, I want to talk about how we could build kind of a scaffold for a debriefing prompt. And so, the idea is, okay, let's come up with a prompt to maybe help us take a transcript or some type of data from an interview and then do this debriefing guide. And in order to do that, you kind of have to have what I'm calling a scaffolding to help you get that, put that together. And so let's talk about the scaffolding. So you're going to find several resources online teaching basic concepts about prompt engineering. And I want you to just think about what we're talking today as kind of a super simple companion to that.
Mhm.
It's not going to go into a ton of detail about how LLMs work. It's not going to go into deep meditation on how to write all kinds of prompts for all kinds of purposes. It's just going to be a simple structure to help you scaffold together a debriefing prompt or any prompt based off of the most essential things that LLMs can do. It's going to be also a mnemonic, a simple way of remembering how to both use prompt engineering in this context, but also to remember the verbs that are important for what you're trying to do. Verbs are about to become an important part of the conversation. Um, so I'm going to talk about get prompts. This is meant to be the mnemonic that I was talking about, GET, generate, extract, transform. These are the most essential types of prompts that you're going to run into. I'm going to talk briefly about what these prompts are about, and how we build that scaffold that I was talking about here in a second. First, I want to call out that everything that I'm talking about here, I've learned from somebody else. None of this is like I came into being in my own brain. I learned this through reading a lot of articles, through experimentation. We're kind of entering this time frame where attribution is becoming a serious concern. And so I
Yeah.
want to call attention to the fact that this David Shapiro article, Becoming a ChatGPT Maestro, is one of the main sources of the material I'm going to be talking about. I've kind of condensed this down and applied it to a specific case. If anybody's really interested in this, I definitely encourage checking this article out. It was super interesting, super informative, and you'll see echoes of it in the scaffolding talk that I'm about to give. So let's talk about these different prompt types. So I talked about get, generate, extract, transform. Let's talk about the generation form. One of the most common things that LLMs can do is they can generate something completely new, but that's contextually relevant to an input. So think of these as those prompts that are catalysts for crafting your initial draft emails, your brainstorms, you give it an input and it helps you expand upon those and build something new out of that. There's some important verbs to think about that will help you accomplish that task. When you're building your prompts, you want to use verbs like create, brainstorm, develop for me, compose a new email or rough draft, that kind of thing. Those are the types of verbs that the LLM will anchor heavily upon when building some of these assets that we're talking about. So here's some examples that would be applicable in research. So create 3 variants of an open-ended survey question that collects respondents' most recent reflections on using Adobe Illustrator. It's using create as the important verb there. That gets you into that generative space that an LLM can excel in. So that's the G in get, generate. Extract. What a lot of people don't think about a lot when they think about LLMs is their ability to extract a completely new idea, or sorry, a new summarization or a new piece of information from an existing corpus. So extraction is about distilling some input from an input from a body of text or some type of source input, doing some analysis and extracting something out of it. And so it's not generating something new; it's just reframing or distilling, extracting something from something existing. I'm struggling with a better way of describing extraction, but you'll see a couple of examples here in a second. But the verbs that are important here are things like boil down, condense, summarize. Summarize is one of the most common scenarios. Summarize the meeting notes, summarize the email, that sort of thing. As a researcher, these are the kind of things that you're likely to see this pattern applied. Summarize the key themes of this paper in 500 words. Classify these statements into some categories, and then you might feed it some examples. So those are examples of classification and summarization, which is really the LLM going through and either using your examples or your input and then extracting and matching to that based off of what it's seen. So that's extract. Now let's talk about transform. So the idea here is to alter the form or the perspective of a piece of content or an input without really introducing new information, but just trying to ensure that that transformation focuses on modifying something existing into a more meaningful or coherent form. This is where you get into translation. This is where you get into a lot of those examples where it's like, hey, tell me or explain this concept to me in the voice of a journalist, or explain it to me as though I was a high school student. The verbs here are things like change, convert, reframe, and reformat are my favorites. I use those a lot because I'm often learning new concepts really quickly. I'm saying, okay, explain to me, dependency injection in the way a journalist would explain it. And now you can also use other things like analogies, use or explain, this concept to me using an analogy of something more familiar. That's a
Yeah.
really powerful example. Um, Here's some examples that you might actually see in research as well. Translate this technical manual from English to Spanish. Reword this one concept into something that's easier to follow. So this is actually where LLMs become super powerful. I think, you can, if you're doing a lot of desk research, especially, and you're trying to ramp up on a new domain, this is your go-to. Once you get some key references and some key concepts down, you can use this to really explore and unpack things.
Yeah, and if I
So
can add something here,
yeah,
is that this last piece of transformation almost feel that you can even ask to utilize certain mental model. I've used some of different types of GPTs and LLMs to extract information that comes from a legal background and I don't understand. So I
right.
asked them to transform that lingo that is in a patent into a language that comes from a product designer, product management perspective. So I'm super, like, this is one of my favorite use cases by far.
Yeah, this is, I think, for researchers, one of perhaps the one of the patterns that they use more frequently without even thinking about it. They just do it intuitively because this is kind of our job. So,
Yes.
um, so those are three basic, most sort of foundational elements of prompt engineering. I mean, of course, there are more, and you can go into, I think, a master class, if you will, of prompt engineering that will elaborate on these further. But these are the patterns you're going to use the most. They're also the patterns that we're going to use as part of our scaffolding for our debriefing prompt. This is just a slide that I'm going to include in the assets that we publish to the site for this talk, basically just kind of summarizing the points that I just made. What I want to really kind of end on this section with is verbs. Verbs are super important. You want to be really thoughtful about the verbs that you use, especially if you're worried about hallucinations or if you're worried about clarity. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that in a second because it's going to come up in our scaffolding discussion. All right. So before we start going into the prompt itself, I want to talk about scaffolding. So I've borrowed this idea from software engineering, and what it basically means is to have a shell or a skeleton of an app in software that's already pre-built and ready to use, and then you just add the parts that are relevant for your specific use case. So that way you're not having to constantly write the whole thing from scratch. So in our example, you know you're going to have a research question. You know you're probably going to have hypotheses. You're going to have other elements that you're going to want to extract from the interview, or summarize from the interview. What's going to change from study to study or from session to session are going to be usually just the hypotheses. There's going to be a finite set of things that change, but the operations that happen in a debriefing guide are typically the same. Or I'm going to argue that in this case, we're making them the same for the purposes of comparison. Um, so what you can do is you can use um, sort of a pre-built prompt that then basically leaves space, not quite wildcards, but space for you to go in and then add those elements when you're doing your discussion guide. So let's say you're going through your normal process of planning your study. What you can do is have the scaffold at the ready to say, okay, now that I've done with my discussion guide, I can add my research questions, I can add my hypothesis to this prompt, and I'm done. I can run this prompt every time after every discussion guide, and we can, as long as we've got a transcript or some type of source material to work with, we'll have some feedback for debriefing. That's the idea behind the scaffold.
Mhm.
So what I'm going to do is now I'm going to step through the scaffold of the prompt that we use for your example. And I'm not going to drain the entire prompt. I'm going to include the prompt for reference, but I don't want to, because it's kind of a long prompt. I'm just going to show you the kind of the big picture. So that way, when we look at the results, you can kind of get a sense
Yeah.
of what the inputs were and what the outputs were. So starting with the first big piece, the role, the goal, and the flow control. So this is another thing that I've stolen from software engineering, this idea of flow control. A lot of times you hear about prompts talking about do this, do that, step by step, chain of thought, all of those process oriented um, uh, prompts require some type of flow control. That's what I'm using to talk about flow control here. But let's talk about role first. This really opens up a wide domain of context about methodologies, biases, and interviewer expectations that we'll reference throughout the prompt. And so the role that I've asked it to assume is a qualitative researcher. That basically invokes that domain of expectations. Um, the goal, the second one, your goal is to help extract insights. This is where I'm starting to use those verbs. The intention here is to have it focus more on the extraction and the transformation of content versus generation. I don't want it to come up with things that are new. I want it to extract information from what it's got, the transcript. Then I get into the flow control. You'll first review the transcript. You'll then review the research question, hypothesis list, and validation rules. So what the idea is that you give it sort of a recipe to follow, and this is that initial set of instructions to tell it sort of how to follow that recipe. The other thing that I'm going to mention here is around debriefing questions. So there are going to be elements that we want to capture in that moment that I mentioned before that are important for our debriefing. Those are things that you're going to want to kind of think about in advance. And so let's talk about that, debriefing questions. So these are those elements that we might use post-it notes to put on the board. These are things we learned about the participant. This is where they're coming from, their type of occupational or academic background, that kind of thing. The research question, what specific research questions that you have coming into the study, bring that in as context as part of the prompt. Quote extraction. The other thing that I've asked the prompt to do is to actually parse through the transcript and identify participant quotes that are relevant to the research questions. This will help us develop that flavor for how the prompt for actually how the session went. The quotes are often the thing that gets remembered most, that in the video. And then next is hypothesis validation. And this is something that in our group where I currently work, we work a lot with hypothesis. We actually have a hypothesis progression framework is actually part of the methodology that we use here. And so hypothesis validation is just always a part of the way we do business, especially after sessions. We want to identify which hypotheses were supported or not. And so here, what you would want to do is you would want to list out your hypotheses, and you would also want to give it the criteria for evaluating hypotheses. What constitutes a valid versus an invalid versus an inconclusive hypothesis. Build those instructions into your prompt. The other thing to think about is new hypothesis extraction. In the conversation that we had, there were new hypotheses that came out that weren't a part of the hypotheses coming into it. This is another thing that could be super valuable in coming away from a debriefing session, identifying something that wasn't originally part of the study plan. And then finally, this piece around interviewer feedback, identifying moments where you exhibited bad habits, asking leading questions, interrupting the participant, exhibiting some form of bias, social desirability bias being one of them. Those are all things that you can include as part of either this prompt or even a separate prompt. You could create a whole separate prompt to look at the same transcript and just say, give me interviewer feedback about everything that happened in this interview that could be used to make for a better interviewer and a better interviewing practice later. We've done that before. I've just sort of packed it here into this scaffold so that we can get a sense of just the breadth of things that you can do and how you might go about them. And that's what's embedded in the prompt itself. Okay. And then you have references. And so now we've given a whole bunch of context and instructions. Now the references that you point out in the prompt itself. So list out your research questions or hypotheses. If you have validation rules that you want it to use, spell them out. I recommend that if you're doing the hypothesis validation piece, because otherwise it's going to make up its own rules. You don't want it to do that. You want it to be explicit. And then if there are specific bad habits that you're wanting to reference as part of that interviewer feedback, list them with examples. And I've got a few examples in the prompt we'll talk about in a second. But the idea is in the scaffold, you've got this instruction set telling it what to do. You've got the debriefing guide giving it the outline of its output. And then now you've got the references. And this is the piece that you would edit or make changes to from one study to the next. The idea being it's all compartmentalized and the work is a little bit lighter weight once you get your first prompt off the ground. Anyway, so that's the idea behind the scaffold. I do have some closing thoughts. I want to come back to that after we've had a chance to look at your results. So as I mentioned, we had this interview a while back. What happened is let me bring up the prompt itself. So here's the prompt itself. This is basically the full expression of what I was describing before. Here you have all of that initial role, goal, and flow control. Here are the debriefing questions. Here are the research the instructions around the research questions. All of this is still giving it instructions. Now we get into the two research questions. Now we're getting into references. What is the influence of the academic or occupational background on their research approach, that kind of thing. Here are the hypotheses that I had, the validation rules, and the bad habits examples. So I just want to show like once you fill this scaffold out, it's actually got quite a bit of data. So here are the results. So here's where I'll be interested to have a conversation with you about, I was interviewing you, so this is about your experience. Let's step through it and kind of get first off your reaction to the type of output. This was using ChatGPT, GPT 4.0. Give me your thoughts. Let's just start with
Start with the gut reaction.
Yeah.
Oh, first, I was just so delighted to see the structure and the extraction of all the information and in a way that it feel almost ready to be delivered. Like I cannot deny that. Like when I read this, it's like, this is such a good summary. This is something that I would feel almost comfortable to get into the next level, maybe take this to a round with my fellow researchers or with a designer to kind of explore a little bit more if they agree on or not. Because in a way, I felt like a lot of researchers, my not have the luxury to have peers to bounce their ideas at.
Yeah.
So whenever you're doing this and then you have another voice in the room that's detecting patterns that probably you were not attuned to, this is an excellent tool. Like, not all of us have like 3 or 4 UX researchers that we can just say, hey, did you hear that? Hey, what was your reaction when
Right.
the person said that? This is becoming my first hypothesis, or this is my pattern. So in complement to that, I do feel like from the get-go, this felt like reaffirmation that I'm not just listening to this in the void, and maybe I'm just listening to my own biases or paying attention to the things that I want to pay attention, that validates my hypotheses or that validate the business hypotheses. So in a way, even though we're designing the prompt and we're creating the system to extract the knowledge, it made me feel more comfortable to say, hey, I didn't do this solo or entirely solo. I rely on a piece of technology that is helping me also kind of frame things in a way that they're rational and they're not just only talking about my emotional constraints or the way that I felt that day, the way that I felt about a participant, because we always struggle with that. Like, if somebody, it's way more open to speak and a participant is giving you all the right information, you're fighting all the time. We're not just giving into your emotional biases and just go through that and report your findings based on that. It's a constant thing. And you also want to give the business a good set of, how can I say this, a good set of insights for it to continue and pivot whatever it has to be pivot or not. So when I look at this, it at least gave me that relief. Of course, I have my own biases against LLMs, but from the get-go, I felt like it was a pretty solid piece to summarize or debriefing. It was positive.
And the couple of things I'm taking away from your reaction is, one is this could be a benefit to uh, organizations that are short staffed, where you're the lone you're the lone ranger, researcher,
Yeah.
maybe even researcher designer, um, and so that could be a help. But I think also with that is a caution not to over rely on it, because one of the things I think is one of the rightful criticisms is that it has this conviction and this certainty in the language that
Yeah.
has a little bit of a persuasive quality to it. And you need to look at it with continued skepticism. In fact, I would argue that there's like two core competencies to researchers that I think go sort of underemphasized. One is, deep sense of deep ability to channel their own empathy, and the other one is that ability to remain skeptical, to the point of being tiresome in their skepticism, because it's easy to kind of get into these moments where you're getting all this
Yeah.
confirmation.
Yeah.
And so this is, I think, going to be a new skill, especially as LLMs become more polished, more embedded in things. Got to keep your eyes open for those things. That are they telling you what you want to hear, or is it actually what you saw? The third thing I would mention is that, and I've kind of seen this come up over and over again when I talk to researchers. I think we even got whiffs of this in your interview. One of the concerns around using LLMs, there's like using LLMs for productivity, kind of write the email, summarize the notes.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of one level of comfort. And then there's like do the analysis. And that's where like I get a little, the consensus is a little
Yeah.
more iffy. Like, and I think there are a couple of things that I think are my hypotheses around the motivations behind that. One is, the more someone else is doing the analysis, the less connected you are with the conclusions of the analysis.
Yeah. And
And that makes you vulnerable. Good.
yeah, no, exactly. I think it's really good to scale your productivity. That's what I'm getting at. Like, it's really good for that. Now, in terms of quality, there's another conversation there, and trust. We might be able to feel like the extraction, it's something that they, all the GPTs or the LLMs that you can touch, they're really good at extract certain level of information that is very concrete. But there's also this fear of the context that sometimes might escape even the best of the LLMs as for now. And you talk about something during your introduction that was the what is the progressive hypotheses framework that you
The
have?
hypothesis progression framework, right?
The hypothesis progression framework. So that definitely hint at the knowledge that we share in a context or a work environment where the whole team is together developing that knowledge. And I don't think that that type of context, even if you try to embed and train an LLM, is going to evolve like the team evolves. There's, it's just
Mm,
a cultural
mhm.
transformation. Like you're starting to understand the appetite of the customer. You're starting to understand how users might feel about certain features, or what is the balance between an organization that invests in a tool or buys a tool versus the people who actually use it. So there's like always those things that might escape this, because this is like a box that is closed to a certain degree. It only knows what it knows, but it doesn't have all of that input from the reality of your business, your customers, I don't know, maybe even internal feuds between products. All of those things are way more complicated to explain and just feed into this. So that is like when the quality comes into play, because the quality is, it also talks about a very complex context. So it's not just about what did you learn here, but in the real world, something is slightly different to what you're reading here.
I couldn't agree more, especially once you start getting into very specialized fields. You talked a lot about the legal field. You get
Yeah.
into medical, financial services, that sort of thing. We have a lot of members who operate in those industries, and I think they're also closed off to public LLMs. There's
Yeah.
no way Fidelity is ever going to let you do this. There's no way Intel is going to let you do this. What you may have in your organization eventually is your own sort of lockdown, secured LLM that has been built and blessed and managed by your IT department. Um, and in those cases, it's still important, I think, to have that that level of skepticism, but also that organizational view, and that historical knowledge built into this review,
Exactly.
built
Exactly.
into how you construct these kinds of prompts. So let's talk about your reaction to the conclusions of that. This is something I've been actually really eager to hear from you, because I know what it looked like from my point of view. I want to hear about what your reaction is. Let's start with the participant summary.
Okay. Well, the first thing is that my role, it's stated that I'm a UX researcher, and it might be half of fact, because I've always been a journalist. I cover a wide range of things that go from the traditional trait of UX. When everybody was talking about building empathy and design thinking, many of us were just shoveled into the role of researchers, and we train on how to design research protocols and what is the research etiquette. And I'm not from a social background, social sciences background. I come from art and digital media. And the reason why I joined the UX wagon is because it was way more enjoyable to have data that concretely address a solution that was transformed into a visual medium. So that is the part that I really truly enjoy. I felt that art or fine art was way more subjective for my personality type. I I mean, I do enjoy art. I do enjoy going to a museum, going to an exhibit, but in essence, the way that it works, and again, we're talking about bigger context, right? Like Carolina enjoys art. That would be like a fact for an LLM.
Right,
The
right.
reality is enjoying the world of art is a complete different question. Like being somebody that enjoys going out like into the market fairs and going to every opening of an exhibit and having all those like high connections and always going after that, like building relationships. Probably that's not necessarily who I am. Like I am somebody that enjoys data but also enjoys making those connections. And when I see this, like I do see some things that are not necessarily true, They're
Sure.
partial truths. So, like, yes, the summary it could be true, but it is not entirely real. I'm not a UX researcher. I'm a combination of both. And I will always proudly say that I'm a full stack designer or I'm a UX generalist. That is the best way of defining it, but it is not a common term. And we go about commonalities and the way that LLMs are trained. So, in essence, could apply to me, the UX researcher, but not entirely. Because I also do design and I train on Figma and I know about design systems and I know about handoffs and all of those things.
Yeah, I would say it was a partial truth, but the incomplete truth. And this is actually one of the criticisms of personas, and this is one of the
Mhm.
I think one of the challenges of any kind of debriefing summatization work. It's like how do you encapsulate, because all these points that you mentioned, actually you did mention in our interview. You talked about your background in journalism, you talked about your point of view on generalist, being kind of a design, not a design generalist, but just your what you described as your full stack point of
Yeah,
view. And so for it to synthesize it to that level is would be in the debriefing. Like, let's put us back in the labs, right? Let's say we were debriefing and talking about this. Everything you just said would have to be revised. Like, we'd have to go and crack this open and type, well,
yeah,
actually, Caro's a, she considers herself a full stack designer. This is accurate, but really it is a small slice of a bigger pie of
yeah.
things that she is. Yeah.
And I try to mention this just because I do know the depth and the lengths of UX researchers and how passionate they are. You even mentioned this in the beginning that they can get so passionate about something that it becomes their flag. Like I've met them if they're, for example, somebody that goes to the lengths of protecting people in terms of how AI is adopted in a company,
Mhm.
they might get even fired. And I know they're very passionate about it. In a way, like, because I'm in between, I do not embody those passions and I do respect them deeply. But I have to say, I'm more of that person that it is very optimistic about technology and always been. So I'll say I will be the first one in the bandwagon of testing a new tool. I'm very pragmatic. I like to like see things firsthand. I'm very curious. That's the things that I love doing. So that's why I always am proceeding with caution there.
Well, let me ask you, what do you think about the research question? So the influence of your academic or occupational background on your methods, and so a
I
shift from fine arts to. Oh, go ahead.
no, please finish the question.
So I'm just kind of focusing on the second bullet point. A shift from fine arts to UX research demonstrated a transition from subjective artistic approaches to data-driven structured approaches. What do you think about that?
Then we have moments like that. Like, yes, that's a very articulated way of summarizing what I try to explain on a lot of words. So I there's a few pieces here that I felt very delighted to read. And it even helped me articulate better who I am. I was going through a round of interviews for new jobs. And I gotta say, some of the things that we discussed previously, it helped me to sell my story better, to clean it
Okay.
out. And I think you talk about that level of extraction that can be very beneficial, like reframing an extraction. That single line, I think it's something that I took to different interviews and it helped. People understood better why I did what I did in a more succinct manner.
Yeah, this is actually raising an interesting point, not so much about this specific case, but about LLMs in general. A lot of times, just getting that second perspective, that alternate view. I've written several prompts where it's like, take the point of view of an engineer, or take the point of view of a graphic designer, or take the point of view of a journalist. And it's really helped me both build vocabulary and I would say even literacy, because it points to different contributors that kind of help me flesh out my understanding of something. And that's not so much about the conclusions that it draws, but it's about the concepts that it kind of helps you rethink from your own perspective. And I've had that happen to me too, not so much in this exact case, but in other projects that I've worked on where I'm having to learn something new or get a new fresh perspective on something. Um,
I completely agree with what you're saying, and sometimes it's the quality of the prompt that could take the LLM of being just an intern to really perform as a colleague. So sometimes
that's
you
a
can give
great
it,
that's a great analogy.
yeah,
The really handy and useful intern to the sort of insightful essential colleague. Yeah.
yes, yes.
What do you think about the second one? Researchers' attitudes about using LLMs for work and how they differ from other areas of life. So, you mentioned using it for administrative tasks, early stage ideation. You see it as helpful for overcoming those initial blocks. Um, but what do you think about those first two bullets first before we
Well,
move on?
I think, well, the first two bullets. So I'm in love with all of the things that I can delegate to an LLM.
Okay.
There's a few things that I do not want to invest the energy of my mind or the stress to reply to an uncomfortable email. I have literally used it. I don't know if it's like coaching type emotional coaching. So like I have the situation with a neighbor and I need to send them some sort of note. And I'm struggling to make it polite and make it also something that gets their attention. So I write all this essay about my situation, and it starts giving me hints on how to navigate the situation. It's almost like scenario modeling.
Yeah.
So it's a simulation. So it gives me answers and potential reactions to something that I really don't want to face in the real world, but I have to do it. So I have to do this thing, this administrative email to the probably the teacher or somebody in school that I really don't want to write. So all of those things I'm in love with. Like let's just delegate things that I really don't want to do because I consider them to be stressful or I consider them to be dumb tasks that do not require my attention. So that is just something that I do enjoy and is truthful and again, really well written.
And
And
so
that's perfect.
what I'm hearing here is like where you feel the ROI, the cost of maybe the uncertainty of what it's going to say or the work that you may have to do to clean it up, that cost based compared to the return, it gets this tedious thing off your plate. It helps you navigate a delicate emotional situation, a delicate social situation. So that return compared to that cost is acceptable for a lot of these.
Yeah, for a lot of reasons.
But then
Now,
there's a point where it tips, right? It goes
yes.
the other direction. It's not so acceptable, right?
Yes, exactly. There's a few things that I do notice. The higher the stakes, the lower my trust is. So if it's a situation that the stakes are really high, and it all depends on the way that I frame the email or that I frame my work, that's when my trust becomes a little bit more flimsy. That's where I think skepticism exists. And I think it also goes along the line of that cultural knowledge or understanding the nuance of where I'm sitting or coming from. And a lot of the LLMs that we see that are popular today, and we're talking about democratization of AI, they're training a lot of things. ChatGPT is trained on attention, and it's really good at extracting those things, but it is not trained on emotional recognition necessarily. It is really good at identifying knowledge and is really good at identifying markers that he or it needs to pay attention to and extract those answers for you. But when it comes to that situation that is difficult to really express that it's high stakes, that is when it becomes a little bit blind or a little bit dumber because it doesn't have the full picture and it will
Yeah.
never. So that is, I think, why utilizing this at work, it's something that becomes a risk. Like if we just go after relying on ChatGPT to do research, are you really seeing the bigger picture? Are you really understanding, for example, where the research protocol might have some sort of gaps or challenges? And we all operate on constraints. Design researchers, you have time, you have resources, and those things pull each other in terms of the quality. So whenever you can do one iteration of a some sort of validation sorry, when you do an iteration of validation study, and then you get your findings, well, you understand that that's within that constraint of that research project. But when you do 2 or 3 times, now you get deeper findings. Now you can again advance your knowledge about where the appetite of the customer is, or even change your hypotheses or advance your hypothesis into more specific questions. So that is why I believe it's not the same, because if it's just the one thing, that's fine. If it's something that is going to impact throughout many cycles of your life, professional life, personal life, that's when you become more worried. This has long-term consequences. I cannot just let it fly. It is still, a chain of decisions, a chain reaction.
I think you hit on something that a lot of folks in the research community are struggling to kind of express, um, and identifying those things that kind of tip into that zone of higher stakes. It's not just the job, it's not just the reputation, it's not just the the um, the individual assessment of the quality of the work. It's like so many other things that go into what is hard to describe about our work. And it's the coming together of tacit knowledge. It's the coming together of interpretation of not just the text of the outline of the discussion, the transcript, that text, but it's also the texture of the conversation of what's going unsaid, but is still being communicated or expressed in some way. And those are things that I think we have a hard time really representing as part of the work that we do. Um, Partly because of the way we do it. The way we do it is still very much uh, this combination of art and science. But when it comes to like handing that off to an LLM, it's like summarize the email, sure. Um, Draw a conclusion, hold off. Let me take that from you. And this is I think one of the areas where, let's say you're using this as a debriefing scenario like we've described, you would want to look at all of these conclusions in an editor. You would want to like go through, and what you're doing is an editorial pass. And that's the way I've been trying to characterize a lot of this work is that you're not running a prompt and then emailing it. You're running a prompt, bringing the things that are useful into some type of memo, making your editorial comments, your changes, and your tweaks, and
Yeah.
then you're committing it. What you're committing is still your work. It's not just the LLM. Where you're working in concert with an LLM.
Yeah.
Um,
And just to complete this section here, in working in concert with an LLM, we touched a little bit about this on our previous conversation. That was the generational divide about accepting or not accepting LLMs. I think because we saw the starting and how dumb LLMs were at the beginning, and this is just beginning to explode again after the winter of AI and all that, and it's not stopping no more. I think we are gonna have that ingrained mistrust of the quality and the nuance of artificial intelligence and generative AI. We still gonna live that, and probably there's still gonna be a little seed inside of us, but later on, I think that's gonna start wearing off. I believe that people will be more trustful of those models, and they probably are gonna let them do things that are higher stakes, like driving a car.
yeah, yeah. Well, until we get there, what I'm hoping is that we maintain that skepticism. But the problem is that comes at the cost of attention and time,
Yes.
and that's one of the other things that I'm running into in discussions with the colleagues that I work with, is that it's like, look, Jake, I just don't have the time to double do the work. I don't, you're talking about running an interview, doing my analysis, and then comparing my analysis to its analysis. That's two analysis, dude. um, and I've got a train to catch. I got stuff to do. Um, so I think that people should definitely weigh that in using this. And when in doubt, trust themselves over the LLM until we get to the point where it's running everything. Um, but in the time that we have, I just wanted to, because we do have a couple more minutes, and then I actually have to wrap. I just want to kind of draw attention to the fact that the rest of the output here broke down the request from the prompt. It extracted those quotes. It went through that hypothesis validation, um, and it even gave some interviewer feedback to me. So I want to make sure that we talked just briefly about that. So um, asking some leading questions, I gave it an example, and then it offered a suggestion. That was actually one of the elements of the prompt. Confirmation bias. Um, I checked on these, and they are actually present in the transcript. And this may have been partly because we were doing a demonstration and I just kind of fell into that conversation. But what I like is some of the recommendations that it makes are of a similar, they're a similar recommendation I would have made to myself. Like, you know what I mean? It's like that I think for someone especially who is entering the field, someone who is maybe working on their own and might not have that senior IC or principal or other set of eyes in the session to say, hey, just some feedback for you. This could be super helpful in maintaining just another set of eyes. And so that was one of the reasons why I included this. I really want to call attention to the fact there was a colleague that I work with. His name is Carl Melder. This is his bread and butter. He loves the art of interviewing, and this is one of the things that he contributed to this project when I was working on it internally. And I would feel bad about not acknowledging his influence on this. Um, anyway, a couple more closing thoughts before we wrap. Because we'll probably have
Yeah.
to spend some more time going over this. But let me do this. Let me
So a lot of the things here in the interviewing feedback, it's something that we don't have time allotted 99% of the time. So
right.
how do I improve my interviewing style? How do I do it better? Maybe you will hear it from a colleague. And this is where something nuance happens that is awesome. When a colleague tells you something, tone matters a lot, and you might
Right,
get
right.
offended, and it might be a difficult conversation. When the machine tells you, you're like, okay, got it, noted, and you don't feel like it's, something personal, which is fantastic.
It's discreet, right? This isn't your boss saying, "Hey, Jake, you really kind of led that conversation." It's kind of like that really trusted assistant who can keep any secret you've ever had. It's like, "Hey, buddy, you need to not do that."
Exactly.
um, and so I think that's another benefit to it, especially in something that's as sensitive as criticism. This can give you a way of taking that criticism, take it or leave it. Um, Couple of closing thoughts. This first one actually has got your name written all over it. Be a technologist as well as a researcher. The whole point of this entire conversation is not to advocate using LLM, say, hey, you should do this, or I'm not taking Norman's position where if you don't, you're somehow behind. All I'm saying is be a technologist, build your knowledge and experiment with this so you can enter into these conversations with some knowledge and competence. Um, and mix and match, sort of mix and match to your practice as you see fit. But it's hard to do if you don't experiment. So that's my first piece of advice. This other one you mentioned, this other piece of advice you mentioned too, also have a buddy. You, as much as you can, get another set of eyes on the conclusions you're drawing, especially if they're AI aided. Some people, some organizations have the ability to do that more than others, but if you can get another set of eyes on it, it makes for better, more confidence, better product and more confidence in what you're producing. Um,
Hmm.
this last one, no, not this last one, but this next one is super important. We were doing all of this in ChatGPT, GPT 4.0. The stakes were, I'm not talking about secret company information. I'm not talking about participant or customer information. But when it comes to doing this in real world, you got to be really choosy about where you do this. Otherwise you're kind of open to unintended disclosures. And so I just want to make sure people who may be looking at this or hearing this later think about the nature of the data that's in their corpus that they're using for inputs, and also the data that they're building into their prompts. And if they have any kind of doubts, look into options where they've got more assurances of security. And there are out there. This is something that's becoming, I think, a differentiator among different offerings.
Yeah.
And so, if it's free, they're probably using you for training. And so just know that going into it. Um, and the last thing I'll mention is about the scaffolding approach. So I showed you an example of a scaffolded prompt that had all of those different elements. This is something that you can actually use to exercise your art as a researcher to build your own scaffolding. If you look at it carefully, you will look at it and realize that this is actually a decomposition of how you think. It's a great exercise in understanding your own sort of metacognition. There's another really cool article about basically problem deconstruction, using your prompt engineering skills as a way of better understanding how you solve problems. Either way, no matter which lens you look at it, think about using a scaffolding approach. It'll help keep your work organized. It'll help keep your processes more efficient. And so that was the other goal behind this is that, giving you a set of tools and some ideas around ways of being really efficient about it. Anyway, we are way over time. I hope this was interesting for you. I hope folks in the community find it interesting as well. This is definitely something that we want to get your feedback on and learn about the degree of interest in the community. Maybe we could do more events or perhaps a workshop on it. What do you think? What would your initial impression be?
First and foremost, I love the way that you structure the content to be understandable. The GET acronym really helped me kind of paint more of a clearer picture of what was my use case when I was going into ChatGPT, because that's my choice. I also use Perplexity, but when I was going through it, it's like I got a better understanding of what was my approach and how to formulate my prompt. And I'm gonna definitely read the article that you quoted in the beginning. And at the end, I do feel that this is a great tool to scale whenever you're having a lot of pressure at work and you have to deliver things and you don't have a peer, or whenever, like you're saying, you have two studies that you need to contrast and you have 5 hours to do it and it's 200 pages and there's no way you can contrast 200 pages in that amount of time. So all of these tools serve different purposes, and all of your recommendations make sense to me because, again, like, I'm more enthusiastic about technology than anything else. I do believe that the more you learn about them, the less of a threat they look like, and they become more of a tool. And one of the reasons why I'm enthusiastic about technology is because, I'm like not necessarily feeling any threats from it, but also I think it is important to understand how things are changing in society. And are you gonna have an informed opinion over LLMs? Are you gonna have an informed opinion of Gen AI, or you're just gonna resist it? So we
You
have to have better opinions about this, and we have to use the tools to learn them. But sorry, I know we're closing.
No, no. Well, I'm glad you mentioned this because what you're getting at is probably so near and dear to me right now, in terms of like where I see our organization, but also our discipline needing to go. We're going into this period right now where we're struggling to figure out what to do with LLMs. We're struggling to figure out, like from a broad social sense, there's just a lot of uncertainty around that. But when it comes to us, when it comes to those of us working in user experience design and in product making, eventually we're going to be in the room when the discussion is being had about how to use an LLM, where to use an LLM, where those boundaries should be. And one of the reasons why I've been trying to kind of explore this and bring this into the conversation is because I want to make sure that our concern and fear over things like our jobs and things like that don't override that first bullet about being a technologist. Because if there's going to be anybody in the room with customer empathy kind of in their bones, so to speak, it's going to be the designers, it's going to be the researchers. And then the more educated and informed they are about how these things work and what the issues are, from a grounded perspective, like they know how to use it, the more they're able to do that, the more they're going to be in a position to make the arguments to do the right thing. That's what I hope to accomplish out of this, sort of in a grand scheme of things. It's not to necessarily, like I said, advocate for it, but to really start to build competency, so where people can advocate for the right thing.
Yeah, no, and just one more thing. I do believe that it's not only within the product design realm. I love how you said, but we see these cases coming up time and time again, also in policy and compliance.
Yep.
And
Yeah. Right.
whenever you
Right.
see those trials and the judges are just baffled because they cannot have a smart conversation of what needs to be protected and what needs to be exposed, that is why we need to understand technology. Like, you don't wanna get there when somebody else is making the decision for you. You have to have an informed opinion if you're working in product, either as a UX researcher, product designer, because you're calling the shots, and I agree with you. The conversation will happen. It's not a matter of, like, if it will happen, it's a matter of when. So you will get to your company and they will ask you about tools. They will ask you about how can you work faster because company X, Y, and Z is doing it in a half time.
Right.
So what is your opinion? What is your process? So it's better to have those tools and just overcome certain fears and unwillingness to utilize it, because all of the things that are happening is like, migrating from the horse to the car. You will still love riding a horse. You will still do it like the old school stuff, yes, but it's here and there's nothing that you can do to stop it. So it's better to inform yourself, get yourself ready, think about augmenting your capacity, your productivity in a more positive way than just, being reluctant to experience that firsthand.
Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more.